Early in U.S. history, children who broke the law were treated the same as adult criminals. Across the United States, thousands of children have been sentenced as adults and sent to adult prison. Children as young as 8 have been prosecuted as adults. Beginning in the 1980s, communities across the nation began to experience dramatic increased rates of juvenile crimes. The arrest rate for violent crimes of both male and female began to increase by 1987 and continued to escalate until the 1990s. On my graph, you will see I'm going to elaborate more on how you can see how the rates increased. From 1984 through 1994, the arrest rate of juveniles for violent offenses increased by 78%. Arrests for murder and aggravated assault increased by 45% and 37% from 1989 through 1993. However, since then, juvenile arrest rates have declined. Between 1994 and 1984, violent offense declined by 19%, although they are still 15% higher than the 1989 level. The practice of charging young people as adults was popular in America in the 1990s. As youth crime spiked between 1990 and 2010, the number of juveniles and adults went up by nearly 230%. Nowadays, the percent of juveniles held as adult in prison declined, but it's still higher than when it first started in the 1980s. Children in prison sentenced to death and life and parole. Many up to 30,000 children have sentenced to death and life without parole. Now the percent has decreased, but some states still allow children to be sentenced to death. Southern states were more likely than any other states to sentence children as adults because they were more racist than like other states, and racism was very high. So this is where mass incarceration is referred to as another name for slavery. The racial disparities, I think that's how you say it, and how children were treated in prisons was, while 23.2% of juvenile adults for murder involved African Americans suspected of killing whites. 42.2% of the juveniles life of parole sentences so basically most of the African American people that were sentenced to life in prison were from murder crimes. Most of the African American people sentenced to life from murder crimes were more likely than in the white people. Like white people sentenced for killing black people, they really wasn't accused of the crime, as though African Americans killing the white people, they were accused of the crime and sentenced to life without parole. About half of the white juveniles that were accused of killing African American victims, only 3.6% received life without parole, as 42.2% of the African Americans that killed white received life without parole sentences. And yeah.
Deinstitutionalization is the process of replacing long-stay psychiatric hospitals with less isolated community mental health services for those diagnosed with a mental disorder or developmental disability. Deinstitutionalization has two parts: the moving of the severely mentally ill out of the state institutions and the closing of part or all of these institutions. This moving involves, in reality, it involves moving most of them into jails. Some psychiatrists view this as a benefit, but it really is not. What this really does is take the mentally ill out of proper treatment and throws them into an improper setting for them to receive treatment. Today, an estimated 56% of state prisoners, 45% of federal prisoners, and 64% of jail inmates have a mental health problem. In 1992, the estimated average was 7.2%. In only the past 25 years, these numbers have skyrocketed. These developments are very worrying. If this is the way we are going, the mentally ill will stay in the jails, and they will not be receiving their proper treatment. This will become a cycle for the mentally ill because once they get out of jail, they will not know how to deal with the real world, and they will keep committing crimes that land them back in jail.
According to a study done by the United States Department of Justice, on any given day, approximately 107,000 youth are incarcerated. And of these, approximately 14,500 of them are housed in adult prisons. The number of youth under 18 youth in prison under 18 has more than doubled in the past decade. Part of this is due to 45 states amending legislature to make it easier to prosecute juveniles as adults since 1992. State prisons really don't have the means to house so many incarcerated youth, as only 18 state prison systems have designated youth housing. 13 states don't even have a minimum age for adult prosecution, which means that children as young as 7, 8, or 9 are vulnerable to physical, psychological, and sexual abuse in adult prisons. There's also a higher percentage of Black youth in prison than Black adults in prison, which is 55% versus 48%. And if you look at these statistics for youth crime, 57% are persons crime. So like person related, 21% are property related, only 3% are alcohol related, and only 10% are drug related. If you compare that to the adult percentage of crime, 44% of adult crime is person related, and 20% is property, and 20% is drug related. So a lot of these are crimes where they wouldn't be arrested as adults, but they are arrested because they're underage, like alcohol, tobacco, consensual sex, stuff like that. I mean, if you look at a lot of youths are arrested for tobacco usage, 17-year-olds, and really no value is brought to the fact that they are only a couple months away from being 18. Also, there is 55% of youths is incarcerated, are Black and incarcerated, and only 26% are white and incarcerated. There also isn't a lot of educational services available to incarcerated youth because most of the time they're in adult prisons. So there's only 35 states that have GED preparation in adult prisons. And only 34 states have credit recovery, so where students can get credit while in jail. Also, the United States has a incredibly high rate versus other nations. So per every 100,000 youth, the United States arrests 336, while England only arrests 46, Australia arrests 24, Japan only arrests 0.1%, so it's a pretty stark difference there. So the school to prison pipeline is a concept that argues that the way that our schools, specifically urban schools, are set up, we encourage the movement of specifically Black and Latino students from school straight to prison. And this is perpetrated by like zero tolerance policies, which is a policy that mandates predetermined punishment for specific offenses. For example, 94% of public schools adopt zero tolerance policies for guns, and about 88% for drugs, and 79% for tobacco. One personal example of this is that in 2003, the Center for Juvenile and Criminal Justice released a story about a 13-year-old girl in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who was arrested and detained for 5 weeks for possession of what was thought to be marijuana, but later turned out to be oregano. So a 13-year-old girl spent 5 weeks in jail because she brought oregano to lunch. Between 1999 and 2007, the percentage of Black students being suspended has increased by 12%, while the percentage of white students being suspended has declined since the implementation of zero tolerance policies. So you can see how these zero tolerance policies really create a divide. So a 2007 study by the Advancement Project found that if a child drops out, they're 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than a youth who graduated high school. Black and Latino students are twice as likely to drop out or be expelled than white students. Around 70% of adult males in prison don't have a high school degree or a GED. So that also backs up the fact that if you don't have a high school degree, you're more likely to be in jail. Suspensions and expulsions have also been proven by the Department of Justice to increase the likelihood of a youth dropping out of high school, which eventually leads to incarceration. So, yeah.
In 2012, there was 356,268 mentally ill inmates. And at the state level, that was a 15% increase. And at the jail level, it was a 20% increase. But in 2015, the percentages rose drastically because the state level went up 41%, which is 56% in the state level, 64% in the jail level, and 45% in federal. And with that being said, they changed very drastically because 636,000 people are released yearly from prison, while 11 million enter prison every year. But minorities, that's the main question, because they are the ones who represent most of the incarceration and most of the mentally ill because they don't get help as often as they need to. But estimatedly, there are 571,880 Blacks with mental illness in prison. And the Hispanics are right behind them, very minimum. And when the mental ill are in prisons, they're mostly in solitary confinement. So a quote that I found was, "Don't put them in a box, put them in a bed." That was a very powerful quote, because most of the times the cells are very small. It's usually a 6 foot by 9 foot cell, and that's barely livable. That's about the size of a bathroom or even a dorm room. And so when I looked it up, there were 3 different types. There were some that has cushion all around it, which was for people who were crazy that would bang their heads on the walls. And so when they actually bang their heads on the walls, they would have protection, because the protection would be the foam. But then there were some that they had a bed and bathroom because people were going to be there for a very long time, and the bed was just a wooden box with a little blanket on top or something and a little toilet inside. And then if you were there for just a few hours, a few days, just to calm yourself down after the prisoner or after the guards were trying to save or trying to help you or release you to do something, you had to sit in there because you had to be calm in order for them to let you out. And so, with that being said, there was treatment that the guards gave the mentally ill, and only 33.8% received the treatments. And out of all those, there was 5% that got overnight stay for medical reasons, and 26.8% people got medicine, actual over-the-counter medicine. And then they only had they had professional mental health doctors, but only 22.6% received them. And that's in the state level. And then it only goes downhill with federal and county jails. And so, but another thing that I found was really interesting was most inmates leave prison worse than they started. So being in prison is actually making them a lot worse than what they should be. And a story that I found was a guy named Reginald Murray. He actually liked being he actually got sent to the hospital, and he liked being in the hospital way better because they had better food. Nobody was beating him up because they understood how he felt. But when he was in prison, he felt very different because the police would rough him up and beat him up. And a quote that he said that was really strong was, "To me, being in a mental institute now, I'm thinking if they would have sent me here in the beginning, I wouldn't have to be here in the end." And that was very powerful. So that's it.
Kids are different from adults. They're not as developed as far as the brain science. Young people can change and grow. A good example is the personal experience of Charles Dutton, who received Emmy and 2 Tony Awards. But then when he was a teenager, he was a little bit different. At the age of 13, he was sent to juvenile reform school. And when he was 17, he got into the street knife fight and was sent to prison for 5 years. He received 8 more years for Portrait of God. But he found a good will to change his life and became a popular actor and a good member of society. So I want to talk about our improvement in stopping children's incarceration. Youth incarceration rate declined by 41% since 1995. It's slow and not enough, but people who care and those who take part in protest movements are greatly contribute to changing juvenile system. For example, the Campaign for Youth Justice, whose goal is to end the practice of prosecuting and incarcerating youth under 18, made positive changes in 2005. 11 states have passed laws limiting the ability to place youth adults jails and prisons. 8 states have changed their mandatory minimum sentencing laws to take into account the developmental differences between youth and adults. And another 11 states have changed their transfer laws, making it more likely that youth will stay in the juvenile justice system. Well, so in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in Graham versus Florida, holding that life without parole sentences for juveniles convicted in non-homicide offenses was unconstitutional. 2 years later, the Supreme Court went on one more step forward. In 2012, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in Miller versus Alabama and Jackson versus Hobbs, holding that life without parole sentences for children under age of 18 convicted of homicide was unconstitutional. But several states refused to apply Miller to older cases. On January 25th, 2016, United States Supreme Court made one more important decision in Montgomery versus Louisiana. The states must retroactively apply the ban on mandatory death in prison sentences for juveniles. I think step by step the youth criminal justice system is changing for better, but the problem is that it goes too slowly, and a large number of the young prisoners could spend their lives in prisons waiting for changes.
It's a stark fact that the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, yet we have almost 25% of the world's total prison population. The numbers today are much higher than they were 30, 40 years ago, despite the fact that crime rate is at historic lows. Mentally ill people make up about 55% of prisons for men and about 73% for women. In both cases, that is over half of the whole percentage of federal prisons and state prisons. And if it's not just mental illness and incarceration, in jails and prisons, it's actually sentencing to death as well. So, for example, in 2005, a Texas jury found that Andre Thomas was not insane at the time of his crime, which doesn't make any sense. So, to put this into context, consider that Thomas was then and still is a delusional, paranoid schizophrenic who hears voices from God, and he believes he's telling him to do things, right? So he carved out the organs of his 4-year-old son, his estranged wife, and her 13-month-old daughter, and took them home in his pockets, believing that this would kill the demons inside them. In the days following his arrest, he insisted to a jailhouse nurse that his victims were still alive. That's not even the weirdest part of the story. Thomas' case is in federal appeal, and as it stands, the courts cannot even address the question of whether he is competent to be executed until he is about to be. But should someone as crazy as someone like Andre Thomas even be incarcerated in the first place? So, recently, what's becoming an increasingly popular program that might help these sick people is what are being known as mental health courts. They've sprung up in a number of states as an alternative to incarceration. A shoplifter who has, say, schizophrenia might be screened and found eligible for mental health court and then be sentenced to judicially supervised treatment. These types of courts have expanded rapidly since 2000, and there are now hundreds around the country, which is a positive because the mentally ill need to be hospitalized for what they've done. Like, a lot of them don't even know that they're being sentenced when they are sentenced, or not competent enough to go to trial. And yeah.